of Greg. We worked together in Netflix, and I remember he was a great engineer, and then he was suddenly promoted to management. And it's very rare that Netflix promotes everyone, especially from engineering to management, because they say we are not a family, we are a professional football team, blah blah. They really want to have top talent in each level. And Greg was a natural leader. I was surprised. He was really great manager from day one, and he shared to me later that he was passionate about this. He was reading books. So anyway, I really liked how we were working together, and Greg being my manager. And then after Netflix, Greg worked for Google for 4 years, and then now he's actually engineering director at Disney. So please meet Greg. So Greg, now the stage is yours. I don't know. Do you have a couple of words before I jump into questions?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you all so much for joining. I appreciate that. Um, as was mentioned, I have known Rahul and Igor for a while, and I have really enjoyed working with both of them. Igor and I worked really closely together at Netflix for a couple of years, and that's kind of when I went through the first really major transition in my career from being an engineer and an IC into becoming more focused on management and leading teams. And it's been a pretty interesting and sometimes bumpy journey. And I felt like before I got into management, it was like this huge mystery, and there was a lot of sort of curiosity I had about what happens behind the scenes. And so I'm happy to try to share as much as I can with you all and to maybe demystify some of those processes. But thank you all for spending time today too.
Thanks, Greg. And I have a couple questions to start with. So let's do 1, 2 questions from the crowd. And I will also, so whoever has some question to ask, please write down in the chat, and we will ask 1, 2 questions from the crowd. And then we will also ask some questions to the event that Raul already created. And maybe let's start from the first question, like what to ask during one-on-ones with director or during skip level meetings, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone should be fairly conscientious about this. I think there's a lot of opportunity for engineers and really anyone, myself included, to put in a little bit more thought and preparation to try to get as much as you can out of a one-on-one. And so I think there's a few useful framings here. One is, there's the obvious kind of tactical things, the things that are happening day to day or week to week. And those are good. You should definitely be talking about those pretty often. But I also strongly encourage folks to think about considerations at the higher level. And so this might mean career trajectory type of conversations, getting feedback from your manager on things that he or she thinks that are going really well, things that could be improved, asking about the business more generally. We are all here to create value for the companies that we work with. And a lot of ICs overlook this. And so I think there's actually an opportunity in situations like one-on-ones to differentiate yourself and to understand how your work connects more to the broader business that you're involved in. I think it's a one-on-ones or maybe an overlooked area from an IC's point of view. We typically view them as activities that a manager should be responsible for. But I think there's a lot of room to take more ownership and accountability of your career in total if you're willing to ask difficult questions or have more candid conversations with your manager. Of course, there's other foundational things that have to go into developing that situation too, but I think that's like ideally where we should all be trying to get to. So more specifically about your question, Igor, I think I'd have to think about a much more specific case. But I can say, the more exposure I've had to management, I would say the more time I spend preparing and thinking about what are the constructive and productive things to talk with my manager about.
And do you expect different type of questions when your report comes to you or when your skip level comes to you for one-on-one?
Yeah, I would expect that because they're operating at sort of different levels of maybe experience or visibility. That's actually, I think, a useful paradigm that I maybe didn't have earlier in my career. But this was actually shared to me when I was going through an interview process with Square, and I was meeting with the director, and I was a little bit nervous about meeting with him. I had a really high respect and regard for this individual. But one way he described management to me is it's really just about your level of visibility. So if you think about the CEO at a company, they're sort of like, if you envision, a mountain and a valley, you can think about a person with more senior management experience is sort of higher up the hill, and they're sort of looking over a broader swath of territory. And maybe if you're an IC, I can think about myself in the past as, you're sort of in the forest. You're like in the details of the individual work, and maybe you care about your particular smaller area. But a lot of what it means to become more senior in management is just to have sort of a larger scope of responsibility, and therefore a larger sort of purvey. But that's not, and one thing that I think that's useful about that is it's not that the more senior person is different somehow. I think people with good judgment and who have developed and shown expertise tend to get promoted. But, directors are just people too. We make lots of mistakes. We have lots of personal passions and peeves and everything else associated with a person. So they're not, I used to think of like senior managers as sort of special somehow, but they're not really. It's just it's a different position. It's a different level of responsibility. And you typically have to put in some work to earn that. But, really it's just about how far out are you looking? That's how I think about it more so these days.
Thank you, Greg. I also heard advice from some director. He said, like, especially when I do like skip level or go into like higher ups, one of the important things is if I'm doing something or if I'm driving something and have some ideas, it's very good forum to verify if I am going in the right direction, basically. So high level kind of alignment. And cool. So Harsha is asking a very kind of follow-up question. How frequently do you recommend having one-on-ones with Skip?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. One thing just to touch on, I think, is what's the point of a Skip level check-in? And for me as a director, there's a few different purposes for it. One is to try to, it's hard. The more senior you get, the more likely people are to sort of not tell you the truth. But as much as you can as a senior leader, you want to be trying to dig in and really ascertain like what is the truth of the situation, or what's the real experience of people who are operating at the team level. And so there's a few things I'm looking for in a skip level from my personal point of view, and that's different. Like if I have a skip level with my senior manager, and I'll talk about that. But for the people who are, say, one of my reports, I'm looking for one aspect is just sort of the general career development that my managers are supporting. So as a director, I should have a pretty good idea of who the sort of top performing people in my organization are. And maybe I'm aware of some of the lower performers as well. And so I want to be doing a little bit of health checking there to make sure that, the people who are struggling a little bit more or are more junior are getting the support that they need. And I want to make sure that the high performers are motivated and excited, and making sure that we have, a good amount of alignment and I would say transparency around what we're providing for them. So it basically encouraging them to try to stay. And then there's more tactical stuff. So, I might talk a little bit about digging into some project details, and there's a few benefits for that. So one is improving my own awareness. I think one thing a lot of, maybe I didn't realize when I was working as an engineer, there's just so much to know. Like if you think about all the knowledge on one team of, let's say, like 6 or 7 people, I mean, even for the manager of that team, it's pretty hard to keep up with all of the changes and all the information that's happening on that one team. And then you go up one level from there where you have a director who's maybe managing in total teams of 30 people. I mean, it's pretty much impossible to know everything that's happening. And so there's also some amount of like refresh on information, and just even like not quite status updates, but just informational updates like, oh, we rolled this feature out, but that caused such and such a problem and we had to deprecate this other thing. So just like a little bit more awareness of what's happening kind of at that team or project level. That's super important. So I'm also, really there in those skip level one-on-ones to learn a lot too. That's a huge component of it. And then there's also, I'm pretty candid about this. I think one of the purposes for a skip level like that is also to kind of get a check on, how a manager on my team is functioning too. So I'll ask people directly, like, how's your relationship with your manager? Have they been supportive of you? Are they unblocking you and giving you what you need? Because I need a little bit more, like, it's hard to evaluate a person in a managerial role. And so I need as much information as I can to try to get a lot of different perspectives and make sure that there's a relatively consistent story there too. So there's lots of purposes for me to have a skip level with engineers on my team. And then it kind of flips up the other way. If I'm talking to my manager's manager, there's a few different things I'm doing there. But it goes back to the previous question, which is like, what is the purpose of having those one-on-ones and what am I trying to do there? So that's a pretty interesting one to think about. Like, one way that I have framed this in the past, particularly when I was trying to work on obtaining a more senior role, is really trying to understand what that more senior person is looking for in their staff. Because there's some variability in this within any organization, right? Like a VP at Google is probably going to be looking for some slightly different things than a VP from Disney, for example, where I work now. So, you have to like learn and tune a little bit there, but I've always been genuinely interested in what are the concerns of those people at that next level, because that also starts to inform my own kind of career path about what I enjoy doing and how I want to solve problems for the company.
Thank you, Greg. So let me ask top-voted question from Tarolink that Raul mentioned. So from Javier, the question is very interesting, I think. What were some of the most influential reading materials for you, Greg?
Yeah, I read a few great ones, and I'm going to do a little trick here and pull up some of my notes as well. But there's a couple that come to mind immediately, but I'm going to have to look them up as well. So give me 1 second here. So I would say there's one, Igor, that you and I have actually talked about in the past that was quite good. I'm just looking up the name here.
Leading Teams.
Who wrote that one?
Oh, I forgot. I also remember The Advantage from Patrick Lencioni. I think you recommended me this one.
Yeah, that one was pretty good. There was this one that I'm thinking of in particular that I want to find. And just give me 1 second here. I'll mention also, while I'm looking for this one, one kind of, it's sort of like technology adjacent, but it's like close enough that I'll put it in this bucket. But there was a book called Creativity Inc. It was written by a guy named Ed Catmull. That one is a really fun book because it mixes sort of tech stories, Pixar stories, and management stories into this really interesting kind of narrative about how mainly Pixar was producing their films, but as you probably all know, they produced the first fully computer-generated animated movies. And so talking through like what that process of creativity looked like, and also working with Steve Jobs when he was at Pixar too. That's a book that I highly recommend. And
what did you learn from it, by the way?
Well, he had some really interesting nuggets on management as well. And I can't think of a specific example right now, but it was definitely a very illuminating book for me. You know, he was a very senior manager in that position, so had quite a bit of responsibility. But um,
So
but
it
yeah,
was
this
Ed Catmull and Amy Velos, right?
I'm not sure if it was co-authored. I know Ed was one of the leads.
Okay.
And then another book that I absolutely loved, it's a little bit more oriented towards startup businesses, but it's a book called Beyond Entrepreneurship. It's co-authored by Collins and Lazier. And this was a book that I actually learned about at Netflix. It was mentioned by Reed Hastings, and he sort of described it as like the template for how he um, sort of thought about Netflix. And it was a little bit shocking to me because I learned a lot about Netflix and the culture there um, for like 2 years before I heard about this book. And then I read this book and I was like, oh, this is where he got all this stuff from. Like it had a lot of resonance with the ideas at Netflix were contained in this Beyond Entrepreneurship book. I love reading it. I've read it twice so far. It's focused though, it's not a pure management book. It's more focused on how to think about setting up and growing a business to scale. So it's like planting the seeds for how to grow or how to set up a fast growing business. So that's one book that I really enjoyed and I recommend. And along the lines of just more pure like engineering management, um, there are a few ones out there. There's The Advantage that you mentioned, Igor. That one's pretty good. There's Servant Leadership, which is also pretty good. There's another one called Leading Teams, which is one that I also really enjoyed. Um, Setting the stage for great performances. I think you mentioned this, Igor. This was by Richard Hackman, and that one was quite good. That's a little bit more pure, like if you are a manager or if you're thinking about becoming a manager, that book is a little bit more squarely oriented towards that set of tasks. Did you have a question?
Setting the stage for top performers, you said?
For great performances.
Okay. Cool.
And can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so I wanted to zoom out a bit. So Greg, I feel like you've done the who's who of Silicon Valley in your career. You did Amazon, you did Netflix, you did Google. Then you took a career break, and it sounds like for about a year and a half you were traveling the world, you were reading a lot, you were doing a bunch of things, and then you came back, and now you're a director at Disney. So I think maybe two questions. One is, as much as you want to share, could you talk about the reason for the career break? Was it like burnout, or just you wanted to spend time with family, or whatever it might have been? Like, would love to hear about that, because I feel like the narrative, at least for me and my friend group in Silicon Valley, is you have to hustle, you have to work hard, you have to go as, type A, go as hard as you can to make $1 billion, right? Or $1 million, whatever it is. And so it's really cool that you actually spent a significant amount of time not working. And then I think the other part is you're at Disney now, which is unlike the other companies that are on your resume. It's not a Silicon Valley tech company first. Maybe that's changing, but my impression is that it's very much a creative entertainment company. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about the differences that you see as a Eng director between like the Silicon Valley tech companies you've been at and Disney.
Yeah, for sure. So to start with your first question, yeah, I mean, I always try to be as candid as possible. And so, I'd say that I really struggled in COVID. I was not in a relationship at the time, and I was working out of my 1-bedroom apartment. And there were weeks where I barely left it. I had my laptop and monitor set up on my kitchen table, and it was just Zoom meetings and pandemic and not really getting out very much. And I did that. I had been doing that for about a year and a half when I quit my job at Google. And it was almost entirely a reaction to that. I also felt like I started my career in California in 2004, and so I'm coming up on like 20 years of working here. And yeah, I was just I don't know, I'm a little reluctant to use the word burnout because that sounds really dramatic. Like it was just it was it was just like the crushing grind of being in the same location every day and constantly being on Zoom meetings. And I was just really, really tired of it. I felt like I wasn't doing particularly well in my job. I didn't see a good path to promotion or sort of advancement there. And I, you know, on the more positive side, I was also just really lucky and fortunate in a lot of ways to, you know, financially be able to do that. It's really hard when you have a family and a home and all kinds of other obligations to take that kind of break. And I didn't have those obligations yet. And then also on the, a little bit more on the pull side, I was trying to invest more in different kinds of relationships. I wanted to spend more time with my family. I actually went to go live with my now wife, so that was really important to me as well. So you can see it's a little bit of a combination of stuff, but I really don't think that would have happened if COVID hadn't happened. I was just so, you know, it was it was a really hard time and just not a great version of life for a little while. And so I've always kind of, you know, considered myself a bit of an explorer. I had all these other interests. I was, as an example, like very interested in ML and learning more about that. So I felt like taking some time off just to, you know, be out in the world again was really important for me. And I didn't feel like I could continue doing a good job the way things were going at the time. So to get to the second part of your second version of your question, Rahul, yeah, it's been really interesting to me. I think one thing that I've noted to people, and I've seen this a lot myself. Actually, I'll mention this in two regards. So the first was that I saw quite a few people that I really admired, like director level and, you know, other really senior and experienced people take pretty significant gaps. There was actually a director I really admired at Amazon, and he took like a year gap every few years on his resume. And I kind of saw at the time that, you know, you can still have a great career and build these breaks into it. It's scary, like no question. I mean, you know, you give up a lot of security and money potentially to take those breaks. But I do believe that if they're important to you and you sort of plan for them a few years out, that they're achievable for most of us. So I highly recommend it. Like if you have the interest in kind of taking these gaps, I think anything from like honestly anything between a month and 3 months, that's nothing. Like I mean, you can basically keep that off of your that will barely even register on your resume at some point, right? So it's really when you start talking about like 6 to 12 months. I would actually add one thing I learned after I do give a note of caution to people now. Going longer than 12 months has a lot more implications than I expected. So it's a really unusual but specific example. If you go to apply for like a home mortgage and you have longer than a 12-month gap in your career history, that's a pretty big strike. Like I actually had to do quite a bit of additional work to get a mortgage in the last, we got one like almost a year ago because I had more than 12 months off. So yeah, that's just one little detail. But yeah, I really don't think it has to be a huge strike against you. I think you can actually position it as, you know, I took a break and I really wanted to do such and such set of things, and I was able to accomplish that. It's a very fulfilling experience. And then another thing I note that also, you know, I sort of saw along my career trajectory is that a lot of people tend to get locked into trying to figure out a way to get promoted in their current job. And I like to be honest about this because there's lots of different ways to assume more responsibility. And I've only really been promoted once in a job, but there are lots of ways to kind of navigate the situation such that you actually get promotions between jobs. So it's a little bit of a different way to play it. But that's worked really well for me. Like, you have to rely a lot on your reputation and your previous network and the sort of view that people have of you. There's some people would call this like personal branding, like getting into that kind of territory.
Yeah.
But that absolutely played out for me with Disney, where the person who hired me knew me from a previous job at Netflix, actually. And so based on like what she knew about me from that time that I was there, which was a 5-year overlap, as well as the things that I'd continued to do afterwards at Google, she was willing to take that bet on me, because ultimately promotions are generally about, who are you willing to take a bet on? And so you have to be somebody that people feel comfortable doing that for and want to do that for. And I think there's lots of techniques and ways to do that, but it's something I think that is sometimes overlooked, that there's lots of ways to kind of grow up without the most pure getting promoted in role.
Well, thanks, Greg.
Yeah, for sure. If I'm going too long in any of my answers to you, please cut me off.
Yeah, maybe just let's accelerate because we have many questions. And by the way, what about the second question from Raul about Disney and Silicon Valley companies?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, if you have
yeah.
anything there, Greg, just like culture difference between entertainment LA-based company versus the Silicon Valley-based company. If there is anything interesting there, otherwise we can move on.
There is, and again, I always try to be candid. I have struggled adapting to a non-tech company. There's lots of reasons for that, but part of it is I was very accustomed to engineering having a pretty large say in what happens and how things get built. And it's been a very different experience at Disney. It is definitely not as engineering oriented, and there's lots and lots of ways that shows up. And it's been a challenging experience, to be really honest.
Thank you, Greg. So from the chat, question from Books. Sorry, I don't know what Books means. Hopefully I pronounced correctly. What specific methodologies or technologies do you believe could dramatically increase an engineering team's velocity?
I'll mention a couple of really different things. Just a few different considerations. Like I can't diagnose the specific team without knowing them, but I like that comment. Long answers are gems to bring out the nuance. That's true. But a few considerations for velocity. So one thing that I think a lot about is testing. So this is like the Achilles heel of software development, right? I've worked at, Rahul mentioned some of the companies I worked at. Nobody does a great job with testing as far as I've seen. Everyone has different practices about this, but it's really hard to do this really well. And I think that absolutely testing, like the process of automated validation that your team has, will speak to velocity. Another aspect I would consider in there is sort of the team culture and how's the team gelling? Like, what are the interpersonal relationships like amongst team members? I think that can have a dramatic effect on velocity in terms of how much people trust each other, how much they're communicating with each other, how they respond to outside requests or asks is all really important and relevant. Another thing I've noticed a lot actually from Disney, kind of touching on that last topic as well. There's larger systems at play. So like a really interesting example was at Netflix, they had this idea on the backend teams about a sort of paved path, which was if you follow this path of development for such and such a type of system, we have a really, really fast way to accelerate you out of the gate. So, you can have a system up and running, deployed, probably some basic test infrastructure. It's all very well understood. And so they made accelerated paths where if you were just trying to do very typical things, they made that very, very easy. And so there's elements like that can drastically accelerate the time, the overall velocity of a team and the time to launch products and features. And then Another thing that I'm thinking about is ChatGPT. So we've had, I'm sure a lot of people here have had some interesting experiences with it. My eyes were honestly really opened. I think it was February or March of this year, and we work with quite a few developers in South America. So they're non-native English speakers, and there were a couple of occasions that were just sort of like really eye-opening. So first of all, they started using ChatGPT for translating a lot of concepts, both from English into their native language, Spanish, and vice versa. So a lot of times they would end up doing a little bit more preparation up front to try to better communicate their ideas back to us in English. So that was really helpful. And then there was also this case where we started using it more directly for debugging. And you have to be careful here because your company policies will dictate a lot of this, and they can be prohibitive. So you have to be a little careful about this. But we did have some cases where we were able to use ChatGPT to diagnose some script failures that we were having. And so I've also been wondering, on the team velocity question, I think it's pretty natural to start thinking about how large language models are going to accelerate our development processes too. So I think there's a lot of considerations in velocity. There's a lot of stuff that has to go right and a lot of stuff that has to go well. And I think there also has to be a desire from within the team itself to go faster and move quickly.
Thank you, Greg. So Howard is asking about, what do you put in your resume on LinkedIn to accommodate those longer gaps? I found on your LinkedIn, and I linked here, that you honestly put there like gap year with all the specifics. But I don't know, do you have any ideas about it? Did you try different things? What overall your thought about gaps on your resume and LinkedIn?
Yeah, I was nervous about this to the earlier conversation. I was afraid that, it would look like I just took the year off and had done absolutely nothing, like took a year off and had nothing to show for it. And that was a fear of mine. I'm not saying that that's necessarily valid. I think it's totally acceptable to just take 12 months off and do whatever you want, like sit in front of the TV or read a book or go to a beach or whatever. Like that should be up to you. But when it came back to trying to apply for jobs again and positioning myself and trying to re-enter the job market, I did feel like it was valuable and potentially would make me stand out actually a little bit. So I tried to use it as an opportunity to say like, well, I had all this time off, but I actually did find the time and the motivation to read through this ML book, which I did. Like that was genuinely interesting to me. I'd wanted to spend time on that area for probably 2 or 3 years and finally got to it with my gap year. So, I tried to position it as, yeah, I took some time off, but I also used it to learn these things, which is all true. I would never try to lie or exaggerate in any of my experience. But yeah, I feel like I did, in the back of my head, I was also doing it to try to make sure that I still had good chances when I went back to the job market, and even potentially like change the course of my work. It didn't happen to work out this way, but I felt like after I'd taken this kind of deep dive into ML, I did feel like it set me up to more readily work on a team that was working with ML. So like, I don't think I'm at all qualified to work on developing a model itself, but I feel like I could work more readily with ML-based applications. So like, I have a friend, for example, who's doing a startup that is using LLMs to create choose your own adventure stories. So she doesn't have direct knowledge of the LLM itself, but she's becoming like a really powerful user of LLMs. And so that's where I feel like I position myself, like I could probably take on a role that's includes something like that.
Yeah, 2022 was perfect year to read about ML and AI. You are envisioning that it's coming, right?
It's still a good time. I mean, I think, when you look at like the really big inflection points, it's pretty hyped. LLMs are pretty hyped right now, but I do believe that there's a lot of value that's going to be coming out of these things. So, I was like, to be really clear and candid, like I was very negative on crypto. I didn't see a lot of value and future in that, but I do believe that there's a pretty strong and compelling proposition for LLMs and related ML. So I absolutely don't think it's too late to invest in that. Like I got into Android in 2010 and I felt like I was a little bit late, but actually the really, really big jobs for Android came out in like 2014, 2015. So there's a bit of a lag. If you have any interest in ML, I think now is a great time to jump into it.
Great point, Greg. Okay, so another question from Anonymous, actually about your career and impact on mentors. Like, what has been your framework in tackling or finding answers to challenging questions while seeking help from a coach or mentor?
Sorry, I think I missed the middle part, Igor. Could you read that bit again?
Yeah, so overall, this is a question about the role played and impact of any mentor or career coach in your career growth, and what has been your framework in tackling or finding answers to challenges or questions while seeking help from a coach or mentor?
Yeah, I would say I'll start talking and then maybe I can narrow in a little bit more on that. But I've never made use specifically of a career coach, but I've been lucky. One of the advantages of working at big companies is just the amazing people that are kind of all around you. And so it's been a while since I've had a formal mentor. I'm not against it at all, but I've just found the sort of what works well for me is a little bit more ad hoc. And I really encourage people to do this. I find I've spoken with a few junior people more recently, and it's been interesting to see there's like a little bit more reluctance to just go out and reach out and talk to people. And I always try to emphasize, not everybody's like this, but a lot of people want to help. Like I think the vast majority of people want to help you. And so one thing I always say to more junior people is like, when you ask somebody for help, you're providing them with the opportunity or an outlet to provide assistance. A lot of people want to do that. So I think if you're not asking for mentorship or guidance from people around you, you're missing out on a resource that's quite easily available to you. So as an example, when I was an IC, individual contributor at Netflix, it sort of came up. Like I was expressing an interest to a lot of people that I wanted to take a management role. And so one thing I did that was recommended to me was, interview a load of people who had made that same transition. And I was able to actually find like 5 people just within Netflix who'd gone from IC to management. And so I just booked time with them. I took them for coffee or we met for lunch and I spent an hour. I think you can be very respectful of people's time in those situations. So that means doing a little bit of research beforehand, like who is this person? What have they done? You can learn a little bit more about their current team and situation and a little bit of their history. And come prepared to me also means like thinking of some important questions that you want to try to learn from them and be honest, with your intentions and what you're trying to get out of the conversation. So my opening line to people was, I'm thinking about going into management. I heard that you made that transition and I want to hear more from you. I was even lucky enough to be to learn about some people who had gone into management, decided it wasn't for them, and then gone back to IC roles. And that's also super, super valuable because then you learn about, what's the downside to taking on a new role like this. And it's really important to go in with your eyes open to kind of what can go wrong and what can go poorly. So mentorship to me has meant a very kind of ad hoc group of people. The other thing I'll mention on this is you can kind of find it from all different places and places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So at Netflix, we had generally people there are pretty strong, but we had some really, really interesting people in our HR group. Like I worked really closely with a recruiting partner, and she taught me a ton about how to recruit people, how to connect with people, how to make candidates interested in the work and the role, what kinds of conversations to have, what kinds of questions to ask. So I try to be open-minded about who I can learn from, because I think there's things to learn from all kinds of different people and all kinds of different roles too. Was that a good answer to your question, Igor, or should I go in a different direction too?
Yeah, it's just like, I think it's just personal question, like how do you approach mentorship? And I really like that you went differently, very creative in terms of like finding mentors in cross-functional teams, so just approaching people. And I agree, like people are more often open to provide help than we think. But it's in some way it's percentage game, right? Like if you approach one person, most likely there's a high chance this person is busy, right? But if you approach 10 people, very high chance at least one person will be ready to help you with thing that you need.
Yeah, I feel in my own personal experience, I feel like probably 90% of the people I reach out to have been interested in helping. So, the odds are in your favor, I think, generally.
You're a perfect communicator, Greg. I know that's why probably.
I was not always that good at this, I would add. There's lots of practice in there too.
Cool. Another question actually from me, but it got 2 likes, so I hope it's relevant.
Sure.
How can we actually navigate career progression during these challenging times?
Yeah, I was curious about that, Igor. Actually, what do you mean by these challenging times? Tell me more about that.
I think first of all, it started from the war, then the financial crisis, then the ChatGPT. So tons of people are laid off. When we had job posting in Zoox for backend engineer, we got 1,000 applicants within a week. So it's pretty challenging time for both managers, engineers, and cross-functional partners. Any advices you have?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I'm definitely reminded. I remember the first job that I got in California. It took me well over 6 months to find. It was really a persistence game, and I honestly, like you're pointing out, there are a lot of people who got laid off in the past year. I actually worked. Disney had some layoffs this year, and I spoke with a VP who was laid off, quite surprisingly, in May, and it's very hard. Like she was really excited to find her next role and was working really hard on doing that, and she just accepted a role, I think about a month ago, let's say like early November. So it was about 6 months for her to find her next job as well. I'm not, it's not an easy time. The positions are not as numerous as they were a few years ago, even 2 or 3 years ago. I personally feel very, very lucky that I happened to apply for jobs when I did last year, because there was a window where people were hiring and then that got shut pretty quickly. My general thing here is always just thinking about what's the best way that you can make yourself stand out from other people. And I know like a lot of people try to do this. It's tough. I think one thing I would say is, well, a couple of things. As much as you can, don't settle. Like if you have a good sense that a place is not going to work out very well for you, don't take a job just to take a job. I generally think it's worth holding out for another month or two to try to find something that's a little bit more decent and sustainable. And then the other thing I would encourage is, whatever your area of specialty or focus is, like try to go even deeper on that. So as an example of that, I'd say when I was hiring a lot of Android engineers, for example, you get some people who, they're sort of lightly invested in the platform. Maybe they've dabbled in some other platforms as well to try to build out some broad experience. But honestly, what worked really well for me there was finding people who are really deep and specialized. So if you're into Android, then, you know, go the extra mile in your free time to create some interesting application that you can showcase, or, you know, go one level deeper in the stack. Like maybe you've worked at the application layer for a long time, go one layer down, like do something with I'm thinking of like the Vulkan 3 graphics, or like really dig into the space to try to do something new that could potentially differentiate you. And I think an important piece here is relying on your passions to guide this. So I think it's really, really hard to try to force yourself to like and enjoy a topic, but, you know, go lead with your interest. Like if you're interested in graphics, go with that. If you're interested in cameras and photography and how to show images well, go do something with that. And I think like it both maintains a certain level of skill and practice that you can continue to use between jobs. And then it also functions as a really positive showcase. Like you didn't just take the time off to apply for jobs, you actually took the time to learn something extra and deeper. So I think those are two areas that I'd maybe recommend.
I was sure you'll recommend taking a career gap.
It's very situation dependent. I know, as I mentioned earlier, it's a bit of a luxury, and I think it can be. I say like, if you plan for a few years out, I think most people would be able to do this. But sometimes a lot of people were, you know, very surprised by their layoff this year, and so you may not always have the resources to do that.
Yeah, good point. I actually also found that I can share it here that Y Combinator co-founder Machin works pretty well for people with engineering background. If you are brave enough to go and explore some startup territory and potentially maybe don't earn much money in the first couple of years, but then become a kind of high position person in startup, that's another potential opportunity. And it's very opposite to what we see in LinkedIn when we apply to LinkedIn or any like job application, when there's like hundreds of engineers like us. In Y Combinator, the opposite. Like it's very few engineers and tons of people with ideas. So it's kind of being pretty hot person on dating website. That's a really good feeling. If you want to explore, I also invite everyone. So Michael is asking, do people generally overestimate the requirements to Director Plus levels? Do people generally overestimate the requirements to Director Plus levels? I don't know, Michael, if you want, you can unmute and jump in if you have more specifics.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. I might have used the wrong article there. For Director Plus like positions, do applicants generally overestimate what's required and they don't apply for it?
I see. I'm not totally sure. I think I can say from what I've seen at the director level, I mean, there are a sort of minimum set of expectations that I generally see. So I think commonly what tends to differentiate a director from a manager is the fact that directors are managing managers. And so I think you either have to have like a pretty lengthy and substantial experience being a manager, a frontline manager, or, you know, like I'll be really specific in my case. I had managed managers, but like on a very limited basis. So it was like the manager I managed had, I think, 3 reports, and I did that for about 6 months. So I was like getting a taste of that sort of aspect of management, but not fully there. It depends a lot. Like there's a huge difference in philosophy here between companies. So Google has a philosophy of, we're not going to promote you until you're basically already doing the job. So they want you to take on the responsibility without getting the title. But there's also a lot of other places where it's more of like a betting mentality. Like this person's shown promise. We think that they're doing well, and we anticipate that they do well in this new role, and they'll promote you into that position. So it's a lot of different kind of scenarios that you have to think through. But in general, I think, especially at the director level, so Another difference is, and this was true at Netflix and it's also true at Disney, there's a difference in the managerial kind of leveling that applies to directors. So at Disney, for example, I am a director of the company. So there's a different set of obligations and responsibilities that the company takes by hiring me at that level. It changes like how people are treated within the company, for better or worse. And at Netflix, it was a pretty revered position. The frontline managers were there were a lot, and then everyone who was sort of director level and above was sort of part of a different group of management, where the activities that they would even do were different. There was a different set of offsites. There was a different set of access. At one time, Reed was meeting with every director in the company. I don't think that was true in 2015, but it was for a long time. So you're treated very differently by the company at that level, and so I think the expectations are commensurate with that. Does that answer your question reasonably well, Michael, or is there more I can add?
Yeah, I think it kind of does. It kind of seems like the level of trust you need, it kind of scales with the company. So the bigger the company, the bigger the role.
Yeah, that's generally true. Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so the short answer is that it really depends, right?
Yeah, which is the answer to just like almost every question, but yes.
Right. Thanks.
For sure.
Cool. Then another top question from Taro website. What are your suggestions for someone looking to decide if they want to grow to a staff engineer role or engineering manager role?
They're different tracks. So one conversation I've had with a lot of engineers is, do you want to pursue management? And this has been interesting to me. I've seen people who exhibited a lot of the characteristics that you would look for in selecting a manager, but they just weren't interested in the role. And that's fine. I think a lot of it has to go to your own personal intrinsic motivations, like what gets you excited and jazzed. And I think you've got to play into those things. I think that's very important because it gives you a lot of motivation. So a lot of conversations I've had with engineers are, what interests you about management? The converse of what I said earlier is sometimes you get people who want to go into management because they think it's either sort of the easy way to do it or it's a convenient way for them to expand or grow in their career. And I don't think that's a good reason to go into it. It's a tough job. I'll say that because it's tough in different ways. I'll share like one of the most difficult days I've ever had in my career was there was one day where I let 2 employees go, and that's still like one of the hardest days that I ever had to deal. So it's not hard in an intellectual sense, it's hard in like an emotional and connectivity type of sense. That stuff is really hard. Another kind of framing about management that I like to think about is, when you're an IC, you have your individual challenges, your problems to work on, and that's expected. When you're a manager, it's kind of like everyone's problems on the team are your problems. So you have a lot more issues to deal with, which can make it pretty stressful at times. In terms of the alternate path staff, that's another one where I think like the company that you're working for is pretty important in terms of how they're going to support you in doing that. There's places where the growth into a staff role is pretty well paved. Like it's hard, it's not easy, but there's lots of people who've done it, and you can probably go talk to any one of them and they'll give you really interesting and useful perspective. So if that's a really important goal, I think the first thing to get sorted out there is being at a company where you want to go down that path and you feel like that path is supported. That's very important. There's some companies that just have a philosophy generally of like, they'll promote if they have to, but it's not really, they don't really feel like it's in their best interest, which I would personally disagree with, but I'm just saying there's some companies that feel that way. So you have to kind of set yourself up in the right environment for that. And I've also coached a couple of people on there was a specific case at Google moving from L6 to 7, which is like senior to staff, I believe is the language, something like that. And in that case, like I wasn't necessarily the most qualified person to provide guidance. And so what I did with that individual was, again, go out and find people who have already done that and talk to them, and just made sure that we really had, the two of us, me and the report, had a really clear understanding of what was expected for the next level. And the other challenge in all this that I'll mention too is like, you know, you can have all the desire in the world, but if there aren't the opportunities being presented and given to you, then that's going to impede your progress too. And one thing I was thinking about earlier in the conversation too was, you kind of have to decide at some point, you know, how important is this thing to me? Like, would I leave the company and try to find a different job if this particular need or desire that I have is not met? And there's lots of cases I've seen where people were willing to walk. I think even Igor, I would probably put you under that umbrella as well. And that's good. Like, I think you should do that. If it's so important to you to pursue a particular path that you're willing to leave the company to do that, you should do that. But if you're not as sure, then, you know, take some time, learn, talk to people, read some books, read some websites, and try to develop a better sense for yourself of how important that is for you.
Great answer, Greg. I also think like having been a manager of an intern is a good kind of tryout for you to whether you will like it or not, because it's very different job. Like,
yeah,
it's 180 degrees rotation, I would say, from being IC, when everything depends on you. You plus your laptop decides your destiny in some way, right? Your success. And when you have a team, you're no longer in control. You lose all control. And some people don't realize you also lose authority because you cannot tell people what to do anymore, even if they are junior than you. Before, as your engineer, a tech lead, you could say, "I'll go do this thing," right? As a manager, you cannot do this. Like, you will demotivate the team, right? Especially in bottom-up culture. So you lose most of things. You lose recognition, appreciation. People don't want to have coffee with you anymore, and all the things. You feel lonely. You kind of, I think you lose a lot. And in terms of gain, I think it's just you gain different type of job. Like, if you really enjoy working with people, communication, growing people, and spending most of time dealing with people problems, not code problems, I think that's the path for you. But it doesn't bring you too much except more people problems and more things to think about and less control. But people problems are more challenging than software, I would say, in some way, because they are almost never impossible to just solve. You solve it on some percentage, right?
Yep. It's everything's grayer and muddier for sure.
Yeah, honestly speaking, I was manager for like 6 years, and now, like, as working for startup, I'm coming back to coding. I realize how much control I'm gaining when I'm just coding, because I know where success is.
Yes. The other thing I think about a lot that you trade is specific deliverables for ambiguous generalities. So like, I sometimes really miss, as an IC, you know, you're responsible for a document or a particular PR, a set of tests. Those are very specific and tangible things. And it's nice to have that kind of certainty. And as a manager, you lose so much of that. Like, when you ask somebody, how am I doing? It's a much, much more subjective question than the easy to measure type of metrics that you might use as an IC. So you all, and I still struggle with this, honestly. You know, everything is much less clear in management, for sure.
Good point. So Harsha has follow-up question about, like, if we lose recognition, appreciation, how we are promoted. I think that promotion and recognition is different. Like, recognition when people are telling you great job. As a manager, you rarely hear great job, because also, as also Greg mentioned, it's hard to assess that you did a great job, right? What is your job? Your job is just empower people, and it's not easy to measure. But appreciation and basically promotion is more like part of performance review cycle, right? Which usually is decoupled from day-to-day recognition. And also it happens once per many years, right? So imagine like living for years without any recognition, then finally you are promoted and you can take it as a great recognition. But often people are not promoted, right? Especially once you go into more senior roles, you actually stay there until the end of your career, at least on that company usually, right? So it's much harder to be promoted and definitely lose control over a promotion completely. Because if you have one or two engineers that mess up things and they report to you, there's so small chance you have control over, like you have some control, HR can help, but again, like you're losing all those things.
Yeah. See some questions here.
Yeah, I don't know, Prakash and Key, do you want to unmute and follow up, or do you want us to just read? Feel free to just unmute and jump in.
Yeah, great. Just I really loved some of the anecdotes you shared, so I just thought about it. Like as part of your role, you probably come across this kind of situation where two people in your team are, they don't agree on things, technical, non-technical, or the way project is going, or you may have some difference of opinion with other teams. If you can share one or two anecdotes, like what was your approach, that will give some insight into things.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, even in the last year, I've worked in a couple of situations where, for a variety of reasons, people weren't getting along. There's sometimes this. I think it is useful and valuable to think about the reason why some of the conflict exists. So there's lots of reasons that you can observe and potentially diagnose this as, right? So sometimes it's competing interests, like maybe there's two different projects going and they're both high priority and there's some kind of resource contention. That's a kind of obvious one. There's other larger sort of political type of battles I've seen where, maybe there's some conflict between different types of groups or disciplines. So I'm thinking specifically of an example, a case that a situation I've been working through at Disney where we've had a lot of conflict with our marketing operations people who are using our tools and our engineering teams that were developing those tools. And some of that is a little bit almost existential. Like some of the work we were trying to do in engineering was driving for efficiencies in the space. And that created some conflict with our marketing ops partners. And then there's even a kind of more difficult level, which I've seen, which is also just, I don't know if you've ever seen this, like out on the street or in the parks, like sometimes you'll just have two dogs come across each other and they just hate each other. They'll just go at each other. And I feel like sometimes that happens with people also, where you can't quite pin a reason on it, but there's just maybe like a huge personality conflict or something a little bit intangible where two people just don't get along or like each other. And that one's really tough because it's harder to diagnose and fix. So as a manager, I approach this differently in different situations. One consideration is like, is this person a direct report of mine? Because that's a very different power dynamic than people who are maybe peers of my team or peers of myself. And so there's different things here. Like with someone who's in my reporting chain, you're going to be providing the difficult feedback to them, trying to coach them and educate them. And it's tough. Like I feel like as a manager of managers at this point, sometimes I have to step into the shoes of the other party who my report is disagreeing with and trying to see their side of the situation and story. So it's trying to be, a little bit more objective, but also supportive. And that's a tough line to stay balanced on. So, I'm thinking of conversations I've had with some of my managers recently, where I'm saying like, well, just consider it from their point of view. Like, I think that's a very reasonable thing to do, is just try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand why this would be difficult. And sometimes, the easiest version of this is sometimes just expressing empathy to the person you're disagreeing with. can open a lot of doors. So just acknowledging that, oh, I can see how you have a really tough situation here. You know, I'm sorry that you're going through this, and maybe even offering some way to support them differently. Like you may change your own perspective in this process. That's really important. If it's
That's great. Can I add this, Greg? Like that's
Of
great
course.
point. Like I remember I had one-on-one with my direct report, and that direct report had some problem with relatives, some like sickness, serious situation, and I immediately started to help. And I said, "Don't worry. Let's align the plan. Like just let's make sure that you share like your project state, and then I will help you to transition to other people. You should take your time, go fly to India, take care of your team, of your personal issue, like no worries." So I thought like I'm doing a great job as a manager, and then I realized later that that person is pissed off during the conversation, and then I scheduled one more one-on-one to follow up and realized like, okay, what did I do wrong? Because like every person's individual is very different. That's what I learned from that stuff. And as Greg mentioned, like actually that person didn't want me to solve their problem. That person wanted me just to listen. And by me trying to solve the problem, they actually felt that they didn't find in me the person who can demonstrate empathy towards them. And that's one of the probably the best kind of thing that people can do to each other in any type of like communication, especially if someone is struggling, is first start from empathy, understanding other person of view, and trying to relate as much as you can. Sorry, Greg, you wanted to continue.
No, that's cool. And actually, Igor, you're reminding me, this was a really helpful framework for me. There's sort of 3 modes that you can engage with someone as a listener. And this has been really useful. And I've even, I'll even purposefully talk about this with managers on my team. Like I'll ask them, do you want me to listen, problem solve, or brainstorm? Because in some situations, you're totally right, Igor, different people want different things. And sometimes just assuming that, like, I think as engineers, we tend to bias towards problem solving, and it's not always the best way to function in that situation. So that's a really useful little idea that I picked up along the way. But yeah, the other thing I was just going to mention on conflict is, you know, there is the escalation route. I try to reserve this for the most difficult and challenging situations for a few reasons, but you know, you should be aware that it exists. Amazon put out a really interesting memo a few years ago about the value of escalation, and I think that was a useful reference point for me too. There are times when it is the best thing to do is to escalate. Sometimes your director or VP may be there, part of their job may be to help mediate some of these disputes. Like if it's a prioritization question, that might be the perfect way or person to involve in that conversation. So I don't shy away from it. It's just that I think you have to use it carefully. It's a pretty big hammer.
Great point. I follow up on this. Gene asks like difference between brainstorming and problem solving.
Yeah, it's a good question. Problem solving, is probably more of like me sharing, like a popular version of this is I've had a manager or a report ask me like, what would you do here? And so that's sort of mostly operating in the problem solving space. Like, you know, here's what you need to do to move past this situation. Brainstorming to me is just a lot more open-ended, where it's like, I'm not committing us to a particular way to solve this problem, but we're just going to talk about options. And it's a little bit more of that idea. You come across this a lot in like design thinking or designing in general. It's just being a little bit more open-minded and not bound to any particular solution. It's just talking and thinking with another person about all the different ways that you could solve this problem. It's a nuanced question, but I think they're slightly different.
Good point, Greg. And then what if you look from the other side of the mirror? Like, what do you recommend us to do? What do you recommend anyone to do if their manager is not supportive? What should they do?
Well, I mean, it does go back to that point I made earlier. You know, you should always have your kind of idea of where your line is about when you would walk away. Like, we live in this um, market-based economy. At the end of the day, you know, the company is free to fire us and we're free to leave. And so you always have to kind of have that in the back of your mind. Like, where's your line? Like, what would it take for you to leave? But I think that's a good reference point to have in mind. When I talk more pragmatically with people about their options, a common thing is, well, can you find a different team to try to stay with the company, but you know, working with a different manager or in a slightly different group? That's very dependent on the company that you're at too. So there's a lot of dependency there. But in terms, let's say that you generally like your situation, you're just not having a good relationship with your manager. You know, one thing I would put out there that may not be very comfortable, but like, again, depending on your relationship, you may want to talk with your manager's manager. Like, not in the sense of trying to get them punished or throw them under the bus, but more of like, hey, I'm struggling working with this person, or we're having some communication difficulties, or I don't feel like I'm being supported in the way that I should be supported. And that could have a pretty strong effect. You know, if as long as you're contributing really well, reasonably well to the team, the company generally wants you there and to value your contributions. You know, I think anyone in management would say it's incumbent on them to try to retain that person. So you can try to play it that way. There's different ways to play it directly with your manager too. I mean, you know, I think we've all probably had situations where we haven't necessarily enjoyed working with someone, but it's a functional relationship and that might be enough. So you may want to like reframe or recategorize the relationship from one where like you have to have a very friendly or congenial relationship with someone to just one where it's like, well, it's very functional. Like I do this thing, my manager helps me out in this way. So you may be able to reframe the relationship a little bit. Or if you feel inclined, if you have a little bit more gumption about it, you could, you know, raise this very directly with your manager. Like, I feel like you're not being supportive in the way that I want you to be supportive. And that might seem a little confrontational, but actually I would say, you know, it does also set the stage. If you do decide to leave down the road, you've got a pretty good story there. Like, you know, I tried to raise this concern with you and tried to find a way to get more support from you, but I'm just not getting it. And so I need to move on. So there's a lot, like, again, it's all very gray. Like, there's a lot of different ways to play this. And so this is a situation where maybe having a buddy or a colleague who you can kind of bounce ideas off of, or a mentor even, can be really helpful to kind of toy with these ideas and see what sort of suits you best.
Great point, Greg. Moving now in a little bit more like positive aspect, what do you feel are the ways that you found that helps to build up trust? For example, your manager who wants to be great for their report, what ways you feel helps to build trust and influence? And also with your manager, what you feel, are there any differences in terms of like building trust and influence with your manager and your report?
Yeah, when I think trust, immediately for myself, my mind goes to, you know, am I doing the things that I said that I would do? That's sort of a fundamental aspect of trust to me. So am I good to my word? I think is a really important thing. And then that also goes to, you know, if you go one step further back from that, it's like, well, what are you committing to and what are you able to commit to? So I think I try to be careful about what I commit to in that sense. There's like thinking more about the question, there's a little bit of a hack here. Like, there's a few techniques you can learn about that sort of more readily build trust more quickly. I'm aware of some of these, but you know, there's a bit of a risk of manipulation. There's a really good book on this, actually. It's called Influence. And some of the things they talk about there are like just the act of being a really good listener actually helps to build a lot of trust with people. Another one you can do in person and even also on virtual chat is there's this idea about mirroring. So if you talk and act and move and gesture in the way that the other person is talking and moving and gesturing, that tends to build up a lot of like sympathy and rapport very quickly. So, I'm aware of these. I read about some of these techniques. There's kind of a whole line of insight about this, really. I try to be a little careful. I don't try to purposely be too manipulative to people. I think it's really important to be honest and upfront and candid, and I try to develop a reputation for that. But in terms of the other way, like what helps me to build trust in other people, it's a lot of the similar stuff, like staying true to what their word is or promises. I think documentation is an overlooked method of accountability. So I'm a rigorous note taker, and I try to document a lot of the things that I see and experience and hear. And thanks, Rahul. Nice to see you too. So I try to document stuff, and documentation helps a lot with accountability. Like one thing I've seen, when you don't document things, you tend to have a lot of these like circular conversations. So it's like you'll talk about something, 2 weeks later you revisit it, everyone's forgotten what you talk about, and then 2 weeks later you kind of end up at the same point. So I try to avoid stuff like that. And I think there's an element of trust there that, you're all working in an effort to be efficient about your decision making and to constantly move forward and make progress. So I don't know. It sounds, maybe it's a little simplistic, but that's when I think about like the specifics of trust, that's what I tend to think about or go towards.
Anything like specific you feel in terms of like difference, how you kind of manage your relationship with your reports and with your manager, or it's very similar, building trust and influence?
At this point, it's pretty similar. Like I'm a manager of managers, my manager is a manager of managers. So it just kind of goes to that difference in visibility and scope. But I largely think about myself and my manager as like doing similar kinds of work, just on different scales. So I feel like at my level and above, it starts becoming fairly self-similar, with the added fun that in general, the more senior you become in management, the more politics is involved. And I've heard that fairly consistently from people at many, many different organizations I've worked on. And it's honestly I would put it as a consideration for if you want to go into management path, you probably reach a ceiling for your tolerance of politics. And honestly, I talked with a VP a few months ago who was going to actually go down a step and take a role as a director because of the level of politics that they perceive to be involved at the VP level. So it's a real thing.
Are you comfortable sharing any of specifics, like Harsha is interested in what kind of politics, any real life examples?
Yeah. And I think one thing that's useful here is, because for a long time I was very confused about this idea. It's like I didn't really understand what it meant to be political. And I can give you a good example. And I'm not saying this has happened, but these things do happen. So let's say there was a reorg and there were like 10 managers at the same level. And one of those managers was promoted because they had become really friendly with the person who was doing the promoting, right? So it's less, what it means to me is it's less based on merit and outcomes, and it's more based on relationships and perceived, I don't want to say accomplishments, even like perceptions about the person. So that's what politics means more to me. And it was pointed out to me by a director recently, like there's a certain amount of validity in this, because it kind of goes to what I said before about everything gets a little bit grayer and muddier. You're not going to be able to write up a scorecard for every director at an org and then just promote the person with the highest score. It just is not going to work like that. There's huge relationship components. There's very fuzzy and subjective ratings that are taking place. So a certain amount of it is sort of expected. I think politics becomes dysfunctional when you have clearly less capable people in general who are being promoted. And again, very subjective terms, so it's tricky. And it was also pointed out to me by that same director, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately. But his argument was that there's a healthy kind of politics and there's an unhealthy kind of politics, and you want to have more of the former. And healthy politics is more about branding, your personal reputation, your team reputation, and being able to communicate the achievements that you've done accurately. So it's not that you're trying to manipulate the facts as much as you're trying to present the facts as clearly as possible. So that's an example of maybe what I would say is more on the healthy side of politics.
This reminds me of book, The Five Dysfunctions of the Team, the same author as The Advantage, Patrick Lencioni. And I think he described politics as when people are doing something they don't believe is the right thing to do. This kind of bad politics.
That's an interesting definition.
And actually, maybe follow-up question from Michael about influence. How do you manage people who don't read your documentation?
Yeah, that's tough. That one, that comes up all the time. And you know, there's always the risk that you can be a little bit of a jerk in this situation. Like, you know, you can, there's a good example here in effective and ineffective communication, right? So you could come to someone, you could go back to someone and say, well, didn't you read the documents? Like I told you where the documents were and didn't you read them? And sort of like make them feel bad or shame them a little bit for not reading the documentations. And, you know, maybe sometimes there's a temptation to do that, to belittle the other person a little bit. You might have some sensation or some immediate kind of fulfillment from doing that. But I would argue it's a little bit unhealthy and long-term harmful. I think it's more important generally to create a supportive environment. And we all make mistakes. Like every sin that I've seen other people commit, I've committed myself at some point, and it's important to keep that in mind. So, you know, I'm sure we've all had situations where maybe we haven't been proactive about reading the documentation as we could have. So when it happens for me, you know, I'll give people like a one free pass at least, you know, hey, maybe I didn't share this particular piece of info before, but here's the link and let me know if you have questions. Like that's a pretty supportive, easy answer. Most people will just read the docs and, you know, get back to you. Maybe, Michael, you're talking about a case where it's like a little bit more detrimental. Like maybe this person is purposefully not reading the documentation, which I'd say is like a little bit more egregious in terms of not participating well. You know, I might have a talk with that person. I'm thinking like even more on the level of like engineer to engineer. I'm a big fan. Like if you get the sense that things are starting to go off the rails with someone, I think it's better to start talking with them virtually, or I would have said face to face, but like as real time as you can with them about, you know, what they need, what they're looking for, and how you can assist them. And I think that intention will read through well to them. And unless people are really oblivious, and you know, you do come across these people sometimes, but unless people are really trying to be dysfunctional or resistant or reluctant or wasting time, they'll probably pick up on your cue. And, you know, if you're the kind of person that wants to help people, it's more likely that other people will adopt that mentality too. So this goes into like culture a little bit as well, where it's sort of the supported behaviors and ways of interaction. But you know, I'll always try my best. It's super hard sometimes, to be really honest, but I'll always try to lead with empathy and a little bit more support than I might otherwise. Usually, because partially it's just a little bit selfish. Like usually if I lead that way, people will pick it up and we'll be able to make productive progress from that point forward. Every once in a while, like that won't stick, or there will still continue to be issues, but that alleviates like 80-90% of the problems that I come across. So a little bit of self-interest, but I do think that it goes towards creating an overall more effective group.
And Greg, you have usually, I think, a lot on your shoulders to handle, right? Especially as director of engineering. So another good question, how do you plan your day-to-day work to make sure you're not burning out and managing your meetings? Any frameworks or techniques that you will recommend?
Yeah, well, the simple one for meetings is like, and you have to check this. Again, this has to be contextualized within your larger organization. But this is a great topic for a one-on-one, right, with your manager, if you're feeling these kinds of burdens. But I'm personally a big fan of, if you don't think a meeting is worth going to, then don't go. Like, have some agency over your own time, and you should be choosing the things that you think are most important for you to work on and spend your time on. And if someone's inviting you to a meeting where like every week you just show up, you're not contributing anything, you're not getting much out of the meeting, I mean, in my book, that's 100% fine to just skip. And if somebody asks you about it, I think you have a very defensible reason to not go. You tried, you weren't getting out of it, or weren't getting much out of it, you didn't participate much. I think most people will be understanding of that. But maybe you get someone who's a little more hard-nosed about it or wants people to show face. And again, good to contextualize and talk with your manager about it. But I think you really have to decide like what's more important for both yourself and your team in terms of applying yourself.
Great point, Greg. Okay, I think we should wrap up, like maybe the last question or like topic about the candidates. And I feel there are some questions also on Tower about this. So overall, I would start the question like, what were the most impressive candidates you interviewed? Like, what was special about those people that you interviewed?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to something I said earlier. And with the caveat that, different companies interview so drastically differently. Like, I actually really admire, Rahul has done a lot of work talking about the interview process at big tech. And that is like a very clear and delineated path. A lot of companies then try to imitate or utilize a similar process, but there is a lot of variance. And as you know, Igor, like at Netflix, every manager decided and dictated their own hiring interview process. So, any interview process that people went through was entirely of my own making, and there was some thinking behind the design there. But in general, I think, some of the stuff that always makes people stand out is if you can demonstrate something that is above and beyond or that differentiates you from others. So I'm thinking, like when you think about a really impressive candidate, there are a few people that come to mind, and the theme there is that you could just see that they really cared about their work. And so to anyone here, I'll really double down on this. Like, you've got to go with your interests, because it's really clear when you're in something like an interview situation about your level of passion and enthusiasm for a topic. Like, if you are naturally excited and enthusiastic about something, it shows. And so try to find those things for yourself that you are a little bit more interested in than most people, or just find a little bit more challenging and want to participate in. And so like when I think back on the most impressive candidates, it's like the person who, well, I remember a time when we were interviewing for Android engineers, and there was an individual who had done an entire side project where they were like learning a lot of the new Android techniques of development, and they were able to demonstrate this and show the different iterations and evolution of their own personal project and the ways that they've been thinking about it. I mean, that's just fantastic. Like, you're making my decision very easy at that point, because you're clearly demonstrating competency, ownership, just a real authentic engagement. So to me as a hiring manager, my risk in hiring someone like that is very low, or feels very low. So those are the people in my mind that really stand out, are the ones who have this sort of extra level of passion and interest, and have used that passion to create something really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And follow up on this, like specific things for like staff and principal engineers, like basically anything they should care about in terms of like personal branding. What do you feel? But the official question is like, what's a good model for personal branding that you would recommend for L6 and L7 engineers?
That's tricky. I haven't thought about that before.
Is it still about ownership, about making sure the success of the project that you are driving is your own passion?
No, I would say it a little differently, because your scope is going to be pretty high at that point. But I can share one thing that, in my mind, substantially differentiates people at that senior level. There's this old phrase that I learned. It's actually, I think it was from Joel Spolsky a long time ago. I think it was his, but don't quote me on that. But he had this idea of architect astronauts. And the idea was sort of people who were like very high level and very abstract. And I think you get a lot of problems at the L6, L7 level when you are purely focused on like very abstract architectural decisions. And I've seen a difference. I've personally seen a difference between the really senior lead principal type folks who are still coding and can still dig in and go. Like, I work with a really fantastic person at this level right now, and what he does really well that's interesting is he's not only very functional at that high ambiguous architecture level, he's also incredibly adept at diving into the details and going low level. So like a couple of weeks ago, we had a particular issue. We needed somebody to dig in and actually figure out what had gone wrong with our system. And, he is one of the first people to kind of jump in and try to do that diagnosis. And I think there's a reason for this, right? Like, the low level details are completely connected to the high level architecture and infrastructure, and vice versa. Like, both inform the other. So I think if you want to be really effective and good, productive at the high architecture level, I think you still have to have some really strong understanding of how everything's working at the lower level too. Because that's where I think a lot of the patterns come from. Like, you do enough stuff at the low level and you start to be able to generalize it at a much higher level. So that's one thing I have. This is not an area of expertise for me, but one thing I've very clearly seen in the past 4 or 5 years is this really strong difference between really senior experienced folks who can dig in and go to the low level as compared with folks who don't. And I've seen much better performance from the people who are willing and able to go into that low level.
So this is about like, make sure you understand your framework as a whole, you see high level picture, but you can also dive very deep and understand all the details underneath, right?
Yep. You have a way of thinking and a way of diagnosing that can go very deep and low level, because that's oftentimes where the problems are. So, if you're not able to kind of get down and understand things at that level, you're just not going to be as productive and functional.
Cool. Thank you, Greg. And thanks everyone for staying with us extra few minutes. There are a few questions we couldn't cover today. Also, if anyone have any question, please put in the chat and upvote the ones that you have in the chat, like from on Taro account that Raul shared. And if Greg will have time, he will answer those questions directly on Taro. And yep. Greg, any few words you want to share before we finish?
Yeah, thank you all for the time. I really appreciate this. This is a pretty amazing opportunity for me as well. And I appreciate everyone listening. I hope it was helpful. And if there's anything else that you feel like I might be able to help you with more personally, feel free to write me on LinkedIn or on Taro. I have a profile on Taro now too. So feel free to engage with me if that's helpful in any way, whether you want any kind of like specific question answered or just something more general. I'm always happy to support folks. And again, appreciate the time and appreciate the invite, Igor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. That was a pleasure, and I learned a lot. Thanks a lot, Greg, for sharing this. Have a
Thank you all very
wonderful
much.
rest of the day, everyone.
Yes, take care. See you all.